As a Native American enrolled in the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla, our culture is heavily integrated into the salmon of the Pacific Northwest. As other tribes, bands, and villages going from Alaska to California, we see salmon as akin to us. We refer to them as brother salmon, and we see them as part of our family. They are part of our spiritual beliefs, our traditional foods, and part of our economic base since time immemorial. Without salmon, it is feared that we'd lose our identity, that our traditions would be lost. The tribes were also able to use nature as a time clock as to different seasons for catching which salmon would be running up the river. Each of the five species of salmon are considered to be a different group from each other as salmon people. They were considered to be a gift from the Creator, and the tribal people of the Northwest had a symbiotic relationship between the salmon and themselves. Because of such reverence for the salmon, ceremonies were done in honoring of the salmon and giving thanks to them. It was also up to the tribes to make sure that the water was not polluted and that the salmon's environment was kept to the utmost standards, so the salmon people could be very productive and useful in their life. With such a respect for the salmon people, fisherman took no more fish than was needed to feed his family and his tribe. The rest of the salmon were allowed to spawn upriver and continue the cycle of life. When treaties were made between the tribes of the Northwest, the treaties stated the right of taking fish at usual and accustomed grounds of stations is further secured to say Indians in common with all the citizens of the United States, and the erecting of temporary housing for the purpose of curing together with the privilege of hunting and gathering roots and berries on open, unclaimed lands. With the treaties, the Northwest tribes gave up more than 100,000 square miles of land, now making up much of the territory of Washington, Idaho, Montana, and Oregon. But it still gave the native population the key holding the right to make a living by fishing. With 100 years from signing of the treaties, which promised Northwest tribes the rights to fish, the state of Washington and Oregon was challenging the treaties and forbidding native tribes from fishing at almost all of their usual and accustomed ground stations, and forbidding the use of traditional gear. We have watched in less than 100 years the salmon go from being free to being exploited. We have seen the numbers dwindle to the point that we can no longer count on the salmon to be able to repopulate themselves, that we rely heavily on hatcheries to keep them alive. The loss of habitat due to the increased needs for resources and hydroelectric power. Overfishing for profit has worn down the population also. It has been since the signing of the treaties that Native Americans in the Northwest have had to fight for the right to fish, having to fight against Washington and Oregon state government and the federal government to keep the treaties that were promised. It was during the 1940s that we saw the salmon wars escalate. With Native leaders such as Billy Frank Jr. and Hank Adams, and many others, we were able to reestablish our fishing rights. Finally, after a long, hard battle in the federal courts, the Judge Bolt decision was finally approved by the federal courts in 1979, allowing Native Americans again the rights to fish in their custom and usual places. The greatest threat we now have for the salmon population is dealing with ocean acidification and climate change. We have seen what the effects have been on the clam and oyster industry throughout the state of Washington and Oregon. My concern now is what the effect will be on the salmon and their food web. Will we be starving them to death because we will not be able to give them the proper nutrition that they need from the waters that they're accustomed from? And how will this affect tribes and nations throughout the Northwest? It has been an honor to work with Dr. Jude Apple and be involved with his ongoing research. Jude is an aquatic microbial ecologist. His main focus of research deals with the ecology of the aquatic microbes and their role in the microbial food web. It is his interest in the effects of hypoxia, ocean acidification, and climate change that made me want to work with him. Our hypothesis for this project was to see what the effects would be on algae at high and low CO2 concentrations. What effects would this have on the food chain? Would we see things such as rapid growth happening with the phytoplankton? And what would the calories be for the phytoplankton once they are produced? Would we be producing empty food that had no nutrients to it? With the help of Nam Su, one of Jude's master students, we were able to do many of the different experiments and methods to check the growth of the algae throughout the whole experiment. With the use of phyllometer, we were able to check daily to see what the growth was that was happening with our algae. One of the last experiments we did was to check for the carbon and nitrate levels of the algae after we had processed them. From my perspective of a native environmental science student, I tend to look at the macroecology and the interconnection of all species, including how we connect to the environment. This internship allowed me to look at the effects we were having on microbial level dealing with water quality. For water is sacred, not just the water we drink, but the waters that hold life in them. It is our interdependence with each other that has brought me here. When I look at the food web and study the base of the food chain, I can see the effects we were having and what we were doing in the terms of ocean acidification and climate change. It is from this knowledge that I can see the long-term effects we are having on the salmon population. But we are trying to change things for the better in most native communities. Habitat restoration projects, tearing down of dams to allow rivers to run free so salmon can come back to the place they were born. But most importantly, tribes, bands, villages are again performing salmon ceremonies, giving thanks to this vital part of our family and culture. I was talking to Jude about the weather and how wet and cold the summer had been here in the Northwest for the last couple of years, and the effects it's having on agriculture throughout the state. But looking at it as a native, I see the effects on us as a bad way, but for the life of the salmon, this is great weather. The cold temperature, the abundance of water that flows to the rivers allows for easier life for brother salmon. Some people would say it's climate change. I would like to believe that the salmon ceremonies are bringing back the salmon for now.